If we start to see life as a happening, if we see life as a happening, which means a creation, and let's say we say it's a creation by Source. Source has become the manifestation, and we appear with the manifestation. The person, the individual, is part of the manifestation. If we see that all of life, including the person being here, the person thinking and feeling, the actions and the consequences, are a creation according to Source, which really means not my doing, not my creation, but God's will. That will, that recognition, that understanding will cut off all of the human unhappiness that arises. It won't cut it off instantaneously, because our understanding of that is not going to be necessarily instantaneous. It might appear, it might be instantaneous in terms of an intellectual understanding, where we say, oh, I understand what you're saying. Nothing that happens in life is anything other than God's will. Or, in other words, Source having turned into the story of life. Because if we say God's will and we just leave it as some theoretical God and anyone can come up with their idea of God, then God will be this cruel, kind mix of entity, and we won't know whether to love or hate that entity that is out there, that has made all of this, that is responsible for all of the joy and suffering of humanity. So that's not the God I'm talking about. I'm talking about God as energy or potentiality, becoming the creation, becoming the story of life, the story of time and space, form, causality. And that story, we don't need to label it as good or bad, or it is a creation. It is there for the sake of creativity. So these words are part of the creation. Your reaction, your attitude towards what I'm saying, your attitude towards life is all part of the creation. So if we can imagine a bubble around all of life, all of the whole of the manifestation, including the whole of the universe, from beginning of time to the end of time, and all of the movement, that is all part of the creation. Ramesh used to describe it in a very catchy way. It's all in the can. The creation from the beginning of time to the end of time is like a movie that has been written, acted, directed, produced, and it's in the can. And that simply isn't the general attitude that a human, which is part of the story that's in the can, has. Because it's part of the story of life for the attitude that the human has to be an attitude of personal doership rather than an attitude of it's all happening. So the attitude is not it's a creation in the can. And as a result of that, there is human suffering. So if your objective is to make lots of money, then investigating the non-doership, the creation being an unfolding according to God's will, may not be particularly relevant. Because making the solution of making money may require the understanding of different principles. If you're a seeker, on the other hand, whether we realize it or not, and actually I don't even really need to limit it to seekers, what the human being is really looking for, whether it's a seeker who is on the spiritual seeking path or any other human being, what we're really looking for, whether we realize it or not, is continuous unbroken peace of mind, meaning living life without a resistance to the circumstance as it unfolds. And I say that because circumstance is part of the predetermined story of life, so it's always going to be sometimes pleasure and sometimes pain, not something that we can control. The outcome not in our control. And so what is ideal is really for us to not wish for life to be pleasure, 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 which is not in our control and something it won't be, because life is a mix of sometimes pleasure and sometimes pain. What is available is an attitude of non-resistance to life, and the way that life is accepted, which is really another way of saying the absence of non-resistance. So acceptance is not a positive doing, but rather the absence of non-acceptance. The way life is accepted is when we have an attitude, yes, what happened like that and couldn't have happened any other way. It means the story of being involved and dragging the past into the present can't happen, because what drags the past into the present is that shouldn't have happened like that. Let's keep revisiting that. Let's regret that. Let's have resentment towards what happened in the past. And what that does is it brings a very specific and uncomfortable feeling into the present moment. It contaminates the present moment with an uncomfortableness about oneself and the other in relation to what happened in the past, in relation to what I did that delivered a painful outcome, or what the other did that delivered a painful outcome. And that is based on the attitude of personal doership, meaning the belief that it could have been different, that life could have been different, and I was the one that made it this way, or the other was the one that made it this way, and that myself or the other could have acted differently. And if we start seeing life as a happening where everyone is functioning exactly as they're destined to function, which means urges arise according to a much bigger set of reasonings than the very specific personal reasonings that we attribute onto why something happens. So if we start to see that actually, even though a particular action happened through a particular person, the stream of events that led to that was much, much greater and extended far deeper into the impersonal than we give credit for. And the more impersonal we see the series of events that led up to the present moment, such as, let's say, your parents being born, and their parents being born, and life on earth coming into existence, the more impersonal we see the set of events are that led to my action in this moment, the less personally we can relate to it. And all of our unhappiness in life is because of a certain story about what's happening, a certain attitude towards what's happening, always an attitude to the circumstance, either the circumstance in the past, the circumstance in the present, or the circumstance in the future. And that attitude is an attitude of personal doership, which is simply the non-recognition that life is happening. And so if I point out, if I describe the broad categories of suffering, and if those broad categories of suffering, which are guilt, blame, pride, worry and anxiety, expectation and attachment to outcome, if those broad categories are understood, and the basis on which the thinking of a particular narrative of, let's say, blame towards the other, which is a form of hatred towards the other, if it's understood on what basis, on what assumption, on what attitude, and it's understood that that is essentially a misinterpretation of life, and that misinterpretation is the uncomfortableness we have with oneself and the other in life, which is our suffering, and that is what gets in the way of our peace of mind, which is human happiness. If all of that's understood, then the functioning of that suffering is, its days are numbered. Why are the days numbered? Because it will arise, and the part of the body-mind organism that has been newly conditioned to understand, oh, there's a whole series of movements within the human being that adds a cloud, a filter of uncomfortableness into the present moment. And that happiness is the dissolving of that filter. If the human being becomes conditioned in the working mind, we could say, the working mind is the functional mind that starts to understand dynamics and can start to see dynamics, then that part of the system will start to interfere with the part of the system that has been running unimpeded for so long. And it ran unimpeded because until such time as this new information comes in, the assumption is that this attitude to life of personal doership and guilt and blame and pride and expectation and worry is valid, is an accurate way of seeing life, and therefore an accurate way of responding to life, and is beneficial. That's what it's assumed by the system until it's explained otherwise to be beneficial. That's why it sets in as a habit. Actually, most things, if not all things that humans do, they do because in the moment the assessment is that is going to give me a good result, that is beneficial. So habits that we have, even addictions, let's say, to alcohol or drugs, or the assessment is at a particular point in time, maybe because the feeling is so uncomfortable, there's a very uncomfortable feeling, and the body understands that if it has alcohol, for example, that uncomfortable feeling gets relieved. And so in that moment, it seems like a good idea. And so the habit sets in, oh, this is good for me. And obviously, the consequence is seen to be less significant than the relief that is delivered. And maybe by the time that the consequences start getting significant, the system can't give up the habit because of an addiction to substance. But before that substance addiction was put in place, it was there because it was delivering a relief. And so if the bigger picture is seen, let's say the substance addiction isn't there, if the assessment of the good and the negative consequences are mixed together, and the body really sees this is not good for me, and it really gets the assessment right, then it'll stop doing that particular activity. When the body is then addicted to the substance, that means that stopping the substance delivers an extra layer of pain. And so that extra layer of pain makes it seem like a good idea to have that substance, even if it's seen that the consequence is not so good, because now there's an extra level of pain, which is another reason for having the substance. But essentially what I'm trying to point out here is not so much about addiction, but when something sets in as a habit, it sets in for a reason, and that reason is that it's deemed to be beneficial. And so if life starts to deliver new conditioning that explains that it's really what gets in the way of what we're really looking for, that new information can start to change the balance equation. And so when the habitual blame sets in, which is an attitude to what has happened, then the system might throw up a thought that says, that's suffering. That's suffering in the form of blame, and the other is not the doer. Meaning, it was destined for that event to happen. It couldn't have happened any other way. So the narrative that says it shouldn't have happened and they are the one that is responsible is missing the point. So if the recognition that life is a happening according to God's will sets in on a deep level, and it sets in on a deep level through a gradual observation of life, then eventually the ingrained misunderstanding gets uprooted. So that's really, if we wanted to keep it simple, the shift is a shift from seeing life as a happening, impersonal, not my doing, not the other's doing, that consequences will turn out a certain way and not in our control, then that's really our the shift in attitude that needs to happen. It's a shift in the attitude to shift in what we the attitude by which we interpret what happens. So to hammer home the importance of this, I'll share a story of Ramesh's seeking, if I can remember it. It's been a while since I said it, and what he used to describe as being the significant change or a very significant point in his seeking. And then I'll put forward an investigation that Ramesh would recommend if someone said, "Oh, can I have a practice? Is there a practice you recommend?" And he said, "Well, really no, because if there's a practice, then there's a practicer, and the practicer is the attitude of personal doership trying to make something happen. But with the understanding that sometimes if that doership is in place, the need for a practice, the want for a practice is strong. So he thought, if there is going to be a practice, let's do a practice of investigating how we can't be the doer, how everything is a happening, how one event, any event in the day that you are sure is your event gets investigated. And if we start following a series of explanations about how the events unfold, generic explanations, then we start to see each time we apply those generic explanations of the dynamics that lead to thoughts, lead to actions, lead to consequences, we see it simply cannot be my doing. It was always a happening. Everything is a happening. And so each time the one event in the day that we are sure is my doing gets investigated and is revealed to be a happening and not my doing, then the understanding can go deeper and deeper. The understanding that every time I investigate an action that I'm sure is my doing, I find out it's not my doing. So Ramesh was Indian. He was when he retired at age 60, he retired as the general manager of the Bank of India, acting managing director, I think, so in a fairly high-level position. He had worked for the Bank of India for most of his life, and he said that you can't be a banker if you're not practical. You can't live in a theoretical world when you're dealing with, making financial loan decisions for customers, and you have to look at their businesses and look at their cash flows and look at their profits and look at how much money they want to borrow and make practical decisions. And having been a seeker for his whole life, because he was, he grew up as a part of a Brahmin family in India, and so the tradition is that there would be a family guru, and once a week or on certain occasions, you would go to the family guru, sort of like in temple or church in other religions, and satsang would be given. And this is before retiring, I think. He went to the family guru and was in the group listening, and there was an opportunity to ask a question. And so, being practical, Ramesh said, what will I get after enlightenment that I didn't have before? Now, knowing Ramesh, he was asking that question because that information seemed to be relevant in order to deal with the situation practically. What will I have after enlightenment that I didn't have before? However, maybe a practical question like that was not appropriate in certain settings, or at least maybe to certain teachers. The teacher might have thought that that was an impertinent question. And Ramesh said, based on the response from the teacher, the look on his face from the guru did think it was an impertinent question. And rage, Ramesh could see anger and even almost rage arising. And just before the guru got angry, and for those of you that know, later on, Ramesh had a guru, Nisargadatta Maharaj, and so this isn't Nisargadatta that is being referred to here. Before the guru got angry, other people in the audience seemed very interested in the question. And seeing that a large number of people in the audience were interested in the question, Ramesh said the guru answered the question in a way you would answer when you're not answering the question. So giving an answer to the question that's not really an answer to the question. And he said the question was, what will I have after enlightenment that I didn't have before? And the answer was, when you're enlightened, you'll know. So Ramesh thought, what sort of answer is that? How is that helpful? Maybe the answer was given because it was assumed that approaching the topic in a practical way for most people will just lead them into more and more suffering. And so giving an answer like that may actually interfere with that line of thinking. For Ramesh, that was well versed with dealing with problems, it was his decision to ask that question. Anyway, when he retired, he said, look, I'm going to dedicate myself fully to the spiritual seeking path, and I'm going to approach it very practically. And so he set about investigating for himself using a practical approach. Knowing that he didn't get answers from his gurus in the past, he decided, I'm going to do it myself. I'm going to investigate it myself. And so one of the first questions that he asked is, so what am I really seeking? I need to know what I'm seeking in order to be able to address the problem, in order to be on track and to address those parts of life that are relevant. And so that's why he asked, what is it that I will have after enlightenment that I didn't have before? So the question was designed to essentially create some focus. And he said, well, given, if I'm really honest, I just want to be happy in life. So let me drop all concepts about what it is I'm seeking, and let me go to the honest answers. And that was his conclusion. Actually, I just want to be happy. And then he said, well, what is happiness? He said, I don't really know what happiness is, given that it's not here, because if it was here, I wouldn't be seeking it. So he said, in theory, I know I want to be happy, but I don't really know what happiness is. So he said, let me look at what my unhappiness is. Sounds like a good starting point. If one's looking for unhappiness and if one's looking for happiness and doesn't have the happiness, let's look at one's unhappiness. So he said, I'll wait for a time in the week when I can put my hand on my heart and say, in this moment, I am not happy. In this moment, I am unhappy. And each time that happened, and his attention would land on the fact he's unhappy, he'd investigate, why is he unhappy? And he said, each time he found that his unhappiness had to do with his attitude to a circumstance. And the attitude to the circumstance was either blaming the other, feeling guilty, feeling proud about something that had happened that was positive, worrying about what will happen in the future, and being attached to an outcome, wanting life to be pleasurable. And so, seeing that this is the pattern, he said, well, this actually makes sense. Why would I not feel these feelings? It makes complete sense to feel guilty for those things that I did that didn't deliver good outcomes to those that I love or to myself. It makes sense to blame the other for the things they did that has hurt myself, delivered pain to myself or someone I love. If, on the other hand, I perform well, then it makes sense to be proud, and it makes sense to worry about the future because the outcome may be painful, may not be positive, and it makes sense to want pleasurable outcomes instead of painful outcomes. So having come to that conclusion, saying, well, I'm looking for happiness, my unhappiness arises in the form of my attitude towards the past and the future. and complaining about the present. And it all makes sense to relate to life that way. So the conclusion that Ramesh came to is actually happiness for the human being is not available. He said he'd have to force certain movements that make sense not to be there. So at that stage, he said he felt comfortable having investigated it for himself, having come up with a conclusion that he said made sense for him, and that conclusion is that happiness for the human being is not available in this life. And so he said the seeking then stopped because he had come to this conclusion for himself. And he said, well, if happiness is not available for the human being in this life, then nothing to seek. It just has to be accepted that unhappiness is part and parcel of life and has to be there. So for a while, his seeking stopped. And then he says something very profound and unexpected happened. He received what he calls a message from outside. But that message spontaneously arose as a voice inside that said, Ramesh, you are wrong. Happiness for the human being is available in this life. It's your birthright. It's the human's birthright to be happy in this life. And the basis on which that happiness exists is the basis of every religion. A basis that has been forgotten. And as a result, that's why we've been having religious wars for thousands of years. End of message. So once again, Ramesh, you are wrong. Happiness for the human being is available in this life. In fact, happiness for the human being is your birthright. It's every human being's birthright. And the basis on which this happiness can exist is the very basis of every religion, the basis of which that has been forgotten, which is why we've been having religious wars for thousands of years. So having been quite impacted by the unusualness of this message that he says, felt like it came from outside, a message to Ramesh from outside. He set about following the clue, and the clue is the basis of this happiness that is available for the human being is the basis of every religion, a basis that has been forgotten. So he thought, I should find out what the basis of every religion is. And he was quite interested in Christianity, so he opened up the Bible. And after some time scanning through, he said he came across the four most beautiful words. Thy will be done. And it hit him, those words hit him, as this is the basis of Christianity. Thy will be done, God's will be done. And being familiar with Hinduism, he said Hinduism says the same thing in a more profound way. Thou art the speaker, thou art the listener. It means God is functioning as the speaker and God listens. And then God functions as the speaker in return and God listens. So God is playing both the speaker and the listener. He remembered that in Islam, inshallah means God willing. And since I've been telling this story, I've been told that in Judaism, there is also a very strong reference to God's will. So with that realization, Ramesh rethought his conclusion. Everything is happening according to God's will. Thy will be done. The basis of the religions that has been forgotten, which means religions are fighting against each other, saying, no, my God said this, your God is wrong, your God doesn't exist. And so, on the basis that everything is happening according to God's will, seeing the other as a separate entity that is delivering pain and should have or could have done it differently, hating the other, no longer makes sense. They are the instrument, the vehicle through which one's destiny is being delivered. So it was destined, according to God's will, for me to feel that pain, and it was destiny for the other to be the instrument that God used in order for that pain to be delivered. And in the situation where one is functioning and the outcome is not positive because of the way one functioned, the recognition is that was God using me as a vehicle in order for my destiny and the destiny of those affected to unfold exactly as destined. And so to hate myself, thinking that I should have and I could have acted differently, is based on this old attitude of personal doership. And the future is similarly going to unfold in the same way as the past unfolded, exactly according to God's will. And so this worry about the future makes no sense, because worrying about the future is not going to change it. It's going to just disturb the present moment. And pride is seen to be an attitude towards something that is happening through this body-mind instrument, which is really God's will unfolding. And the outcome, which is deemed to be a good outcome, couldn't have been any other way. So claiming personal ownership over it is once again coming from this attitude of personal doership. And expecting life to be a certain way, thinking that I can make it turn out the way I want it, is once again based on this false belief that life can be different in the future. If we understand it's going to be one way, then we say, let me relax and not expect it to be a particular way. Now, this attitude of non-doership, seeing everything as happening, has nothing to do with how we function biologically, because the biological function in the moment is also part of God's will and will unfold according to our genes and up-to-date conditioning, which is how the will of God unfolds exactly as it's destined, because the will of God includes the human being being designed a particular way, not my doing. A happening that happened because of causality or dynamics that are far more complex than I can understand, and dynamics that are put in place not by me. And so it was this simple recognition for Ramesh, a recognition that set in place by a recognition set in place by an understanding that started to be seen. That whatever happens through the human being is a result of their genes and up-to-date conditioning. Life is always delivering new conditioning, and that new conditioning adds to the existing load of conditioning to create what we can call the up-to-date conditioning. And that's a very impersonal process. We don't choose the parents we're born to, the country we were born in, the socio-economic class we were in, the school we went to, the friends we make, the church and temple that we go to, the political views in the area. And all of that, plus the particulars of the circumstance, that unfold day to day all contribute to our up-to-date conditioning. And our genes don't develop. Our human, the body starts growing from the time that that conception happens, and that growing is not something that happens in an isolated, insulated environment away from the new conditioning, but rather the new conditioning and the genetic growth are not two. So at each point, the human being is a combination of the genetic growth, which is a blueprint unfolding exactly as it's designed to unfold, meaning the development of the body and then the heart and the brain and all of the other biological aspects, and influenced by the new conditioning, which we can sort of look at it as the hardware and the software. And yet the hardware and the software are not really two. They work in tandem with each other, such that they really are not two but one. And it seems that life has ingrained a very different attitude to this attitude of non-doership. An attitude that is largely based on a conclusion of how things work that comes about based on the surface experience that we have. And the surface experience is, I am the one creating my thoughts. I am the one choosing which way to move and what actions to take. And because it feels like I'm in control, then the belief that says I am in control sets in. And that belief has not assessed the situation, hasn't assessed the dynamics too accurately. So the belief is out of line with what actually happens. And then life can come along, deliver new conditioning that has the capacity, if it's received by the system in a certain way, to radically change one's up-to-date conditioning, which means potentially radically changing who we are. Changing the structure of the human being radically, such that the thinking, and in particular the attitude to what happens in life, changes radically. That change in attitude from the attitude of doership, which essentially is an attitude of separation. I am a separate, independent doer, insulated from life, and making decisions based on my insulated nature of life. So that creates a psychological separation that sees the other as a separate doer, insulated from life, and now we're a bunch of competitors, rivals, and enemies. At any time, the other, as a separate, independent doer, can take away my happiness by delivering pain. That's the attitude. And so then we have to be suspicious of the other. We have to be fearful of the other. And so if we're suspicious and fearful, we can't be relaxed. We can't love life, because we're too busy hating life. Hating life in the form of hating the other for what they have done, hating oneself for what I have done. And if we're worried about the future, then we can't relax. So human happiness, that which is available in this life, that which we're looking for, whether we realize it or not, that which spiritual teachings, mystics have been telling us for thousands of years, this is around, this is available. It's often referred to as liberation, enlightenment, self-realization. when you really read in between the lines, when you go through the descriptions of self-realization, you find it has to do with recognizing oneself. And the recognizing of oneself is really a dropping away of the belief of oneself as a separate, independent entity, which is the attitude of separation. And the recognition that what I am is a human being that is not separate from life, through which consciousness is functioning, which is what enables the present moment experience of life to be there, because without consciousness there would be no awareness of life. And so that is the realization of oneself. A human being not separate from life, functioning according to my design, and very importantly, that the core of the human being is consciousness. The consciousness of source, functioning through a biological instrument that is designed to function exactly the way it functions. And with that realization of self, the falling away of the old self happens, which means the falling away of the guilt, the blame, the pride, essentially fear in its many different forms, resistance. And the falling away of fear and resistance is the falling away of non-acceptance of life. So when non-acceptance falls away, you have what is a passive acceptance. So acceptance is the absence of non-acceptance. And that, when you look at it, in between, reading in between the lines, is the happiness that spiritual teachings have been pointing at for thousands of years. Buddha makes it really simple. Enlightenment is the end of suffering. So that's pretty important information. What's available is happiness. Happiness is the end of suffering. Suffering, in practical terms, is guilt, blame, pride, worry and anxiety, expectation and attachment to outcomes. And that is all an attitude to circumstance, not circumstance itself. Circumstance is either pleasure or pain, depending on how the circumstance resonates with the biological pleasures or preferences, the biological preferences. If the circumstance is in line with your preference, it's pleasure. If it's out of line with your preference, then it's pain. And one's attitude to the circumstance, which includes the pleasure or pain, is the layer on which our peace or our suffering exists. If it's an attitude of doership and attachment to outcomes, then that's suffering. If that attitude has fallen away, then the circumstance will be as it is, sometimes pleasure, sometimes pain, and the attitude of suffering is not there, which means peace of mind. And all of this is based on a recognition that life is a happening according to God's will. A predetermined story, if you like, from the perspective of your attitude. The attitude can be, I am aware of life once it happens. And so from the perspective of the attitude to what is happening, that attitude can say, well, it was destined to happen that way. I only became aware of it after it happened, which includes becoming aware of the voice. If there's speaking happens and then the awareness becomes aware of it. Thinking happens and the thinking is aware of it. An action as a consequence of feelings and thoughts happens. And once that action happens, awareness is aware of it. And then a consequence happens and awareness is aware of it. So from the point of view of the awareness, which is the core of the human being, and we can say the layer of the human being that is not mechanical, it witnesses the outputs of the mechanical aspects of the human being. And calling them mechanical aspects isn't reducing them down to very mundane feelings. Even love and all of the emotions, the complex thinking, we're calling it mechanical because it's a response to a circumstance based on one's genes and up-to-date conditioning. But that doesn't change the fact that the response includes the full range of human emotions and feelings and thoughts. And the consciousness becomes aware of those feelings after they arise, becomes aware of the thoughts and the actions and the consequences after they arise. So from the point of view of that which is witnessing life, the attitude can be life unfolds and then there is awareness of it, and therefore what unfolds was determined before the awareness of it. Not my doing, but a happening. Meaning the thought happened, I didn't make it happen because I am that which is aware of the thought after it happens. That which is the thinking is the biological reaction according to one's genes and up-to-date conditioning. That is not optional. That movement that created the thought, created the feeling, created all of the movements, including the heart pumping and all of that is mechanical and not in the control of any entity, any doer. And if we look at what has happened, the deeply ingrained belief of personal doership has created thoughts. And the thought itself says, I should have done it differently. Now that thought that says, I should have done it differently, which includes in it the presupposition of me being the thought, that thought includes in it the error that a mechanical movement could have and should have been different. And that thought is in itself a mechanical movement that couldn't be different. And if at some point life reconditions, updates the conditioning of the biological instrument, the thought can arise that couldn't have happened differently. And the more this happens, the deeper the understanding goes and less of that interaction with life there is. And the simpler and simpler life becomes, and the less interested we are in arguing, the less interested we are in being right. At any moment we're happy to just leave those discussions alone. It's like, oh, you don't agree with me? Okay. That's fine. Because we're all right. That's the attitude. We're all right. We're all playing our role. And if one's happiness is seen to not be found in outcomes, that one's happiness is from being connected to oneself, then the motivation to make the other one wrong and make yourself right has fallen away. Especially if it has moved into interaction that is starting to deliver pain. If the interaction is delivering benefits, then you might point out where the other may be doing something that could be improved, including one's attitude of personal doership. As soon as that the other responds with a reaction or a response that is painful, then it's like, okay, let's leave it. Whereas if it's taken personally, we can't possibly leave it. It's like, I can't leave this. Why would I leave it? I need to fix it. I need to have the other see me as correct. Because until that's the case, I feel like I'm attacked because they're saying I'm wrong. And so then we get into an argument about who's right and who's wrong. So let's see if we have some questions.
Hello.
Hello, how are you?
Well, thank you very, very much. I just discovered you a few days ago, and I can't even begin to tell you how deeply affected, moved, touched I am. And I'm not really very good at doing this, to put it mildly. I'm not very good at expressing myself. I feel, I tried to explain this. I did one other kind of a non-dual retreat recently, and it took me like 2 days to get the courage to speak because it's just very difficult. I feel very inauthentic. I feel like when I try to speak, it isn't, I listen, I understand what you're saying. It's such like a nonverbal level. Mm-hmm. And then when I try to communicate that, there's just no words. Or if I tried to tell someone what I'm learning or how I'm changing, I can't, and I've always been like that. Mm. I remember being a kid and standing up and having to deliver a presentation, and I just would have really preferred to be shot in the head. I mean, it just was horrid. And so, but, it's like there's this one part of me that and I feel your peace. I just feel such a connection to you. It's like it's a completely non-verbal thing, and everything in me just says, yes, this, this just, I connect with this, there's.
I get what you're saying. That's very nice of you to say.
Yeah. Oh, but I know I hear people. Sorry. Go ahead.
No, it's very nice to hear it, but it's also very nice to see that the message is resonating, and hopefully it starts interfering with that movement that has become so habituated and is the different forms of suffering. So have you noticed the various forms of suffering being seen differently?
Yes, definitely. It's really helping. Now, what's really challenging, which kind of ties in with what I was saying, is like, this sounds really funny, but as long as I'm alone, I'm fine. But as soon as I'm with people, that sense of this is, and it's very, very habituated, but that sense of being just really alone and really inauthentic, and whatever I say isn't, I know that there is really no separate me. But yet, when you communicate with people, you're trying to connect. And I just really, for the most part, it's honest, is I just don't. I don't connect. I mean, people would never understand this because I'm always doing nice things for people. But it's like I don't really connect with the person. And I don't know, I remember when I tried to express this in this retreat I did, I was so devastated because the teacher is supposed to be this, whatever. And he just said, well, you lack confidence in yourself. And I said to myself, really? I mean, first of all, I knew that when I was 4, but that wasn't what I expected someone to say, So it's like I would like to, like it's hard to. It's like there's this part of me that so understands what you're saying that I can connect with it from being a child. Like I always understood this, and I even remember being a little kid and trying to say things to people, and realizing like give it up. And then it sort of really went into the background. I remember. Like when you talk about being aware, I had those experiences at such a young age. Of course, I didn't know what was happening. You couldn't talk to anybody. So I don't know if it's, like this sense of always having been separate in even though, like, which sounds ironic, anyway. So I would like to be able to start to really feel like I can connect with human beings and not just like be this. I mean, I am this doer. I'm always doing for everyone, but I want to feel something like that I can bridge this gap. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. It could easily be that, you're wanting things to be different is a layer of suffering. And if that's the case, the first thing I would suggest is just stop, insisting on life. And that would be a complete surrender to your, using your words, so your inauthenticness with someone, let's say, if that's what it is, because I think you use those words, or your inability to communicate well. That's who I am. That's my genes and up-to-date conditioning. I got an interesting email the other day from someone who said she's happy, cheerful, and she seems to annoy people regularly. And in the email, it seemed like she was quite at ease with that. And in a way, we just have to see that our limitations, whatever they happen to be, are in place because that's how we've been designed. Now, to some people that are looking to improve, this doesn't sound like a very great bit of advice, because this advice is essentially a description that says, you'll be one way, and that's the way that life has designed you. And if that's going to change, it's because life is going to bring about the change. So relax about insisting on change being a particular way. And at least that relaxation is the dropping away of a layer of uncomfortableness. And it's really the uncomfortableness that's more of a problem. If we find ourselves with a shortcoming in the way we interact with people, but we're not uncomfortable with it, internally we say, I don't really have a problem, I'm happy. So that's, that's what the teaching is always hammering home, that happiness is not about self-improvement, but rather about the end of resistance, the end of this doership that says it should be different, I'd like it to be different, I want it to be different. So I hope that helps.
It does. So I'm just wondering, say like specifically, you're sitting in a group of people, and this is close family, and really, I would be happy to just not talk,
Mm-hmm.
because I just don't find it, most of what people are talking about, very interesting anyway.
Mm-hmm.
It's just, it. So, I mean, what do you do if you're sitting in a group of people and you'd really, I mean, I'd rather just sit there, and then people start trying to draw you in and get you to talk, and
Mm-hmm.
I don't know what to do in situations like that.
Yeah.
And then I feel like I stick out more, like I would like to recede into the background a little bit, because it's really just more comfortable
Mm-hmm.
to not be forced to engage in, small talk and politics and
Yeah. So
it's
the,
just not, I, I don't know what to do with that.
well, if it's more comfortable to sit in the background, in fact, maybe more comfortable not to be in the situation in the first place, meaning the background isn't your own house instead, or another room or whatever, then that recognition becomes part of your up-to-date conditioning. And I say, why not? Why not limit the amount of exposure to those situations that create less pleasure? And the problem is,
Mm-hmm.
we seem to think, oh, well, I should be an active member of the family, or I should contribute. And I'm saying, well, drop all the shoulds and shouldn'ts and allow life to unfold according to the absence of shoulds and shouldn'ts. And
Mm-hmm.
so the other half of the question is, if someone says, what should I do in these situations? I say, well, there isn't an answer, because I don't know what life is meant to look like or going to
Right,
look like
right.
in the next interaction. So I can't tell you to pipe up
Sure.
or go into the background. So my answer is just allow yourself to function, recognizing that whatever you do, whether it's you go into the background, whether you feel compelled to make small talk, whether you get angry with the people for drawing you in, whatever it is that you do, so I'm not saying don't get angry. I'm saying if anger arises, it's not your doing, it's a happening, it's destiny unfolding. So my suggestion
Mm-hmm.
is, in each moment, do exactly what you think or feel to do, and know that that is destiny
Okay.
unfolding.
Okay, so like, because I do spend a lot of time trying not to go to things, to put myself in those situations, and everybody knows it, and they make fun of me, and like, she's antisocial, and
Mm. Yeah.
So I guess that, I mean, I always think that, like, I'm most comfortable when I don't have to do those things, but then I feel like if I don't push myself to do them, then I'm never gonna. I guess you're just saying, just do what you feel in the moment is what you do, and don't worry about it.
Yeah. And the others are going to have their opinions. That's destiny unfolding. And
Right.
if you feel guilty about the way you are because the other is telling you you're wrong, then that's the belief in personal doership, jumping in, going, yes, I should be different, I'm not good enough. So whenever these different movements of doership pop in, or shoulds and shouldn'ts, which is part of our attachment to outcome, I should be more social, I should be more capable of expressing myself. Hopefully we recognize them and go, oh no, that doesn't have to be the way. Let me just
Mm-hmm.
accept that my antisocialness is part of my genes and up-to-date conditioning. And the irony is that if it's not
Yeah, go ahead.
if it's not an issue for you, what tends to happen is it stops being an issue for other people. And we think the others are the ones that have an issue with it, but really we're probably inviting it somehow.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yes, that makes sense.
you'll find, I think, as you reconcile with it, someone else, the others are going, well, actually, do what you like. Yeah.
sense. Thank you. Do you think you're gonna? I just discovered you a few days ago, and I'm like a little kid. I get up in the morning, and I just can't wait for this to start. It's so wonderful. I mean, I know that I listen to people talking to you, and I know you're so deeply touching so many people. What you're doing is so important. I just was wondering, do you have any sense of how much longer you first on your website it said you're only going to do this to the end of May, and then you continued. You're just kind of taking it day by day.
Yes, actually, it probably still says that. It still says end of May probably on the website.
It does, yeah.
Yeah. I don't know. I thought I was going to do it for 5 days or 10 days, and it's now been 90 or whatever days.
Right.
Yeah, I'm not sure. For now, I still feel like doing it each day, so we'll see. I'll be as surprised as you.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thank you for dropping in.
Thank you so much, Roger. Bless you. Thank you.
Bless you. Hello, Shaista.
Yes. Hi, Roger. How are you?
Yes. Well, thank you.
Okay. So what really happened, I was actually thinking about a few questions was coming last night in my mind, and then the topic you were discussing, it sort of felt related. So I wanted to discuss a little bit, or your input with regards to law of attraction and NLP and all. And I know this obviously is different. They work more on mental level and change your neural pathways and stuff. But I feel when I was in it, like 20 years ago, when I got exposed to, and I got given books, from Nasarita Maharaj to all the other set of books I got given by my friend who was leaving. It had Law of Attraction, it had Tony Robbins, it had many other, and Maharishi and Nasargadatta. 20 years ago, I got attracted to Law of Attraction because I was young and I wanted to, make my life, and I was passionate. And I did. When I was doing that, it felt that as if I was the doer. So I created the life. Wherever I wanted to go, wherever my aspirations were, they all got fulfilled. A career and everything. And obviously, looking back at it now, and now it going deeper into other teaching and stuff, and into my own self, the realization is that maybe, okay, it was there, law of attraction. I created the life I wanted, or it just happened. But it actually was a happening. Like I didn't do, if I look back, I was compelled in the moment to do things. I was compelled to leave the country. And the feeling was so strong, I just couldn't stay. I just had to move. So I guess there are two questions I wanted to ask now, because NLP, law of attraction and all, I got introduced and I lived almost all my life like that. And now I'm at a stage where I have everything going for me. I'm happy, and I've been a seeker on the other side for the past 5-6 years, and everything went deeper. And understanding is that obviously there is no doer, and there was no doer to start off with, and your teaching is helping me a lot. But I'm at a stage where I want to do some. I want to do some NLP courses because I've done this in the past. I want to do a refresher, and I have other friends who are doing in the similar field, like hypnotherapy and helping people out. But at the same time, it's been happening to me for a while that shall I actually go ahead and do refresher and do that course, or go back to my corporate job I had? So it's a constant tug of war for the past few years, and I'm sitting with myself and I'm trying to make sense of it. That okay, my life I have lived through one way. Now I know deeper, but there are people who I can help who are not ready to go so much deeper. I mean, this is why my understanding is, I'm not saying the people can't, but I know I have friends and I have people who one can speak to, and they sort of don't want to go that deep into spirituality this way, but at the same time they want to change their life, and the suffering they want to alleviate somehow or the other. So how are these two related? They are and they are not. Obviously this is much deeper. Your teaching has more elements to it, and this is so they have conflict. Yes, sorry, go on.
If someone is interested in relieving suffering, then I personally think it's important to describe suffering and the basis of the suffering, and how that the basis of the suffering is seeing life in a way that is not necessarily how life is. That creates this attitude of doership and attachment, that creates the guilt, the blame, the pride, the worry, and the expectation. So if someone's looking to alleviate the suffering, then to me, that's what you have to focus on pointing out. If someone's interested in learning how to, have better inter-human communication skills, for example, or be more affectionate, or be more organized, then there's more specific training that you can give to someone like that. So it comes down to whether it's about self-improvement and being a better, more functional person and delivering better outcomes, or whether it's about one's attitude to what happens. Now, even if it's about one's attitude, and it's about the people want to alleviate their suffering, it's true that they might not be ready for a teaching that says, actually you don't exist in the way that you've always known yourself to exist, or you don't exist in the way you believe yourself to be. It can be too destabilizing for someone to even receive that information. The defense mechanisms will shut down and remember not to talk to Shyster again. If their system isn't ready for that. So even if we're alleviating or working on helping people in the area of suffering, there are progressions, I guess, as to what teaching they're willing to listen to, and therefore what teaching is relevant for them. The law of attraction can be seen as a spiritual teaching that is ultimately aimed at peace of mind. Not law of attraction. I don't think law of attraction is so much aimed at peace of mind, but I think it could be part of a movement towards peace of mind. And in a way, it's there because you might have people that have lost self-esteem, have lost motivation in life, and this is a way of making them feel more optimistic, more hopeful. The big danger I see of it is that it creates, it's setting in place an attachment to outcomes, basically, suggesting that your happiness is to be found in manifesting life the way you would really like it. And it reinforces the belief of you are the doer that is, has to function a certain way in order to then successfully manifest the outcomes. So there's a risk in it, because it is going to reaffirm attachment to outcomes and reaffirm doership. However, for some people, it may be what is needed to lift them out of a state that isn't going to get them anywhere towards peace of mind if they remain disillusioned by or unmotivated and depressed. So, it's not an easy decision to make. But if you were asking me about law of attraction, the thing I can see how we can validate that. If someone acts a certain way, then the consequences are going to be correlated with the way they act. So we can say because there's a correlation, we could call that a law of attraction, because there's a link. Then we could call it law of attraction. I would want to emphasize that the initial movement that we are then saying is correlated to an outcome is not your doing, but a happening. that doesn't mean that you shouldn't, necessarily try to, if positive thinking is meant to give you more positive outcomes, which it may, that might be a link. So if law of attraction teaching says if you think positively, you'll get more positive outcomes, then let's encourage someone to think positively if that's what we're trying to achieve, positive outcomes. But knowing that you'll only think positively because life has delivered new conditioning that suggests positive thinking will deliver more positive outcomes. So life has delivered new conditioning, and therefore if the positive thinking happens, it's not your doing, but a happening according to life's will. Whether you can weave that.
No, it makes sense. I mean, in my own case, when I achieved sort of, what I wanted to, then I still wasn't happy and wasn't fulfilled. And then I said, no, hang on, that's it. I've done whatever I could and I've come this far. And, there's something else I need to see because it's working, but it's not working in my personal case in the sense I've got everything and the fulfillment is not there. So that obviously I dug deeper. But what I'm saying is law of attraction, that's one thing. But nowadays, like it's the I am enough movement, which is slightly perhaps deeper, and the hypnotherapy and all. It's just going towards the similar direction. Well, obviously, your teaching or non-duality is much more deeper, and it's a slightly different aspect to it because they are not asking that, your happiness are in the future or when you'll achieve something. So I guess what I'm getting from you is there is a room, there's space for this teaching also in certain people, who are like really not that optimistic, or they have lost their self-esteem, or they, ultimately, obviously, if you seek happiness in outcomes, then obviously that's not it. So I understand what you're saying. So there is a difference, yes, a huge difference.
Yeah, I mean, the NLP, if it's a methodology that can change someone's sense of self from the shameful self to a person that includes less shame, which is based on doership and whatever. So if there's a technique that can, bring about that change, and you are the instrument through which life delivers that technique that actually brings about that change, then, that's a different methodology to bring about less doership in relation to, in less doership attitude that delivers shame.
So I guess I'll just start. It'll take 5 minutes more of you because other people waiting also. So in NLP or in any other teaching, what they are also doing is they're giving you new beliefs, and they're also replacing your old belief to new beliefs. Whereas in your teaching also, like in a few, part of it, you're giving us new beliefs also. Although they seem more powerful to me, in my own case, they really worked. And they eradicated other belief I had, and they did a lot of work, which very quickly. So they're quite similar fundamentally, I would say. I mean, in this area, but then they differ. Obviously, your teaching goes more in present moment and in no attachment to outcome. So changing belief does help, of course. Then in that teaching also, it's fundamentally the same thing.
I'd like to think that it doesn't give someone a new belief. The intention is not to give them a new belief. It's like saying, don't believe anything, actually. Don't believe me. Don't believe. Just look at what's in front of you. And because belief implies, that we say, there's Martians on Mars. And then once I've made that statement, there are Martians on Mars. So do you believe it or not? Is what a belief tends to be. Whereas if you send someone out to the field and ask them to see if there are strawberries growing in the field, and they go out and they look at the strawberries, and then they come back and I say, so are there strawberries growing? And they say, yes, there are strawberries growing. And I say, is that a belief? And they say, well, it's based on my own observation of what's in the field. And so I'd say, well, in that case, it's not a belief. It's more experiential based. So, the attitude of non-doership, I'm not asking someone to believe they're not the doer. I'm asking someone to investigate for themselves and then come up with a conclusion that is actually fundamentally very different to belief. If we believe there is life after death, that's a belief, right? I don't know. I don't think anyone can check it out. So that's a belief. I'm not interested in telling someone there's life after death, because that would be a belief. And furthermore, just in case someone wants to catch me out, which is always important for someone to do that, is that the teaching says whatever is put forward is a concept, not the truth. So essentially it's saying, don't believe anything that I say, because it's not the truth. It's a pointer for you to investigate, so that you can come up with a conclusion for yourself based on your own investigation. And then if you do that, if you come up with a conclusion based on your own investigation, and keep in mind that even your conclusion is a concept, that it's a concept based on investigating life from a particular angle, and you hold that relatively, then we're actually free from belief. So the problem to me is belief, and freedom comes from the end of belief.
No, I think I used the wrong word. It wasn't belief. I meant to say concept. Yes, so that's a huge difference there also. Yes, so yeah, empty of beliefs and everything. But you know yourself to be, or you are. So no, it makes perfect sense. Yes, thank you very much. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Shasta. So when it comes to concepts and beliefs, often I say that I don't have any beliefs, because to me a belief is where we have taken a concept and mistaken it as something absolute, as some sort of truth. And I realize that anything I think is the output of a relative instrument. The thought could be wrong. It could be based on an assessment that doesn't have all of the information. In life, we're never going to understand the whole of the universe and how everything interconnects. So any concept we have has to be by nature limited. And a belief gets put in place when we attitudinally mistake it for the truth and how things actually are. And so I say I have no beliefs on the basic principle that nothing I think, nothing that anyone tells me, nothing that's ever been written down is the truth. At best, they are accurate descriptions of life from a particular perspective. And yet, I say, no beliefs, but thousands of concepts. I have thousands of concepts. How to make a perfect boiled egg to my preferences. All of what I just said about what a belief is and what a concept is, those are concepts. Happiness for the human being is available in this life. That's a concept. Happiness for the human being is the absence of suffering. That's a concept. The absence of suffering is peace of mind. That's a concept. They're all just descriptions. And so that hopefully makes it clearer for someone as to what I mean between the distinction, or what the distinction is between belief and concepts. Hi, Frank.
Hear me?
Yes, I can.
Oh, thanks. Well, I appreciate you calling on me. I have a question about this idea that, and this is the one thing I keep getting stuck on with your teachings, the idea that you say life is a happening according to God's will. So I've been wanting to believe, my whole life I've been wanting to believe that God is all good. Mm-hmm. So when you say that, it makes me question that idea. And, and then you look at the big, things that have happened in in life and in society, like the Holocaust, etc. I have a hard time believing that that's God's will.
Mm-hmm.
Can you talk about that? I'll just leave it there. Can you talk about that?
Yeah. So my, one of the things that we tend to be not very good at is recognizing that words have a specific definition attached to them. Now, not the definition in the dictionary, but our own attributed definition to a word. And sometimes that definition is what you'll find in a dictionary. And sometimes we have the wrong definition on a word, so we mistake what a word means. But for once we attach a definition to a word, as far as we're concerned, that word means what the definition that we have of the word is. And just even exploring language is something we're not so good at. I guess we haven't really been taught that there are these layers. And so words, we learn them when we're young, is a very automatic thing. And so a word seems to have a definition that is unchangeable until we start realizing that there is a definition and I can change the definition. And so often, if someone's talking to me using a certain word, or if I use a certain word, consciousness or whatever, then whoever's hearing it is going to hear what I'm saying according to their definitions of the word. Now, if we start listening to what's said and listen to the context, listen to how it's repeated many times, and start to conclude what definition the person speaking must have about that word, then we can say, oh, there's a change happening in the way we are listening to words and the way we're processing words, what have you. And God is one of these words that's very loaded. So not only is there a definition, but it's a definition that usually is very loaded. Either people have a very strong affinity with the word God, or they've got a very strong resistance to the word God, because of essentially how the word God has been used by their family or for themselves, whether it's delivered pleasure or pain to them, believing in a God or accepting the notion of God. So a lot of people feel very guilty, have been made to feel very guilty because of the notion of God. God's going to punish you for being a bad child or whatever. If you're bad, God will when you die, you'll have eternal damnation. Or vice versa. God can be a concept that we feel very connected to. So that's a long preface to the answer, which is, in my use of the word God, what I mean is not a God that most people have an image of, which is a very specific God, whatever that happens to be for them, but rather God as consciousness or energy, creative energy, creativity. So impersonal, it's not a person, not an entity that thinks and says, oh, I like that person, I don't like that person, I'm going to punish that person. Not one of those entities, but rather energy of some sort, creative energy, that becomes all of the trees, all of the seas, all of the people, all of the thoughts, all of the habits, all of the events and the consequences, the deeds and the consequences. And so it's not, this notion of God being benevolent is not the notion that I have. God is impersonal and has become the story of life. And God, even when I say God's will, it implies God that has a will, and God that is asserting its will, God that has cognized this world a certain way. Whereas God's will to me means God energy has turned into this, and whatever this is by default what I'm calling the will of energy manifesting. And so even saying the will, in this context, we have to understand it doesn't mean some entity with free will or volition, which is how the word will is usually used. It simply means energy turned into all there is, and therefore in each moment, whatever there is energy manifest, which I'm calling God's will. And really the importance of that is it's not my will. Roger is part of energy manifest. And so God's will very often is simply there to counter the false idea of Roger's will. Does that make things...
That doesn't, not the exact, well, I mean, I'm still not satisfied with this. I guess this is something I need to keep working on, because I guess I'm thinking of, is this a matter of, so let me ask you this. Do you think that the idea that when people think that God is benevolent, or want to believe that God is benevolent, is that sort of a naive idea, you think? Or because when I do look at the past, like I realize when you say things are predestined, and I look at everything that's happened up to this very moment, that you're right, it couldn't have happened any other way, because that's exactly what happened. Like even the Holocaust. So are we talking about levels are there levels in life or in consciousness where there is this duality of good and evil? Well, I guess there is. I mean, that probably can answer my own question here. But is there a level where God is all benevolent, where we get to where all there is goodness, and there is none of this duality of good and evil, and et cetera, et cetera? Because when I pray, I want to pray to a God that's benevolent. I don't want to pray to a God that's that's might give me, might cut my leg off or whatever. Who knows? I mean, I don't know if you know what I mean, but
Sure.
and I'm probably a little bit confused in my thinking here. I can see that as I'm talking, but if you can make any sense out of what I said, I'd appreciate some kind of an answer. Thanks.
Yeah. I do think it's, I forgot what word you used, but I liked it. It is wishful thinking, God being benevolent, because clearly if we see this as a creation, it's pretty obvious that there is both pleasure and pain, both good and evil in life, or people that bring about painful actions to others. So I'm not saying it's...
Excuse me, I use the word naive. Do you think it's naive to think that?
Yeah. Well, I think it just isn't... It seems to be a concept that is devoid from an observation of what life is. And so in that case, I think, naive is a good way of putting it, because it lacks critical thought. So that's why I'd say God has become life, and I don't know how we could categorize life as benevolent.
Food for thought.
And
I'm going to leave it there.
The other question is there a God to pray to? Because on my definition of God, God has become the whole of the manifestation, which really means there's no more God left as a outside entity. So prayer to me is praying to no one or to nothing. And yet I can understand that we pray if somehow it makes us feel good. Then prayer can be a movement that happens in life. And even if we're not praying to anyone, it may still be a movement that makes us feel connected, let's say. So anyway, they're my thoughts on God. And once again, I think it's a good time at this point to say what I'm putting forward are Roger's concepts, or concepts that have been influenced by conditioning, new conditioning that life has delivered over a period of time. And so if it offends someone, I'd say, look, it's just a concept, not the truth. If it offends, if it doesn't sit well, then find what does.
And how does this fit in with what's your take on the idea of the fallen man, like the Bible calls it, the Adam and Eve dream, the fallen man idea, where God created everything perfect, and then there was this idea of, like, there was a mist that went over the earth. And I'm not a Bible thumper by any means. I don't even consider myself Christian anymore. But there's a part in the Bible in the beginning, in Genesis, where it says there was a mist that covered the earth, and then man was made from the earth or whatever, and Adam was created, and then Eve was created, the other way around, forget. But anyway, do you have any ideas on that at all? Because it almost seems like the idea of duality, of good and evil, exists in that realm of that second creation, whereas the first creation was completely spiritual and perfect. So, do you have any thoughts on that at all, or am I getting too deep here?
No, I've mentioned the story of Adam and Eve's going back several years ago more regularly than I do now, but I see that as a story, and it depends on how we interpret it. So I see that manifestation happened. Adam and Eve were part of the manifestation, and they were in the Garden of Eden functioning exactly as they were designed to function. The serpent and the apple tree were all part of the manifestation, and one day the serpent became part of the script and the story. So the serpent said what the serpent was destined to say. Adam and Eve responded to those temptations in a certain way, exactly the way they were destined to respond, such that at some point, I think it was Eve ate the apple, which was destined, and at the point that she ate the apple, it was destined for a fall from grace to happen. And the fall from grace was the lack of self-knowledge, because the fruit that they ate was the fruit from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, which is the duality. And so from that point, and not duality more so, but dualism, which is where the thinking comes in and starts seeing everything as good and evil, and separates it out, and doesn't see everything as a whole. And so that's when the false sense of self gets put in place. And it's when they started to feel self-conscious, shameful, guilty, blaming the other. It's your fault. If you hadn't eaten the apple, we'd still be in there enjoying, Eden. And so then the movement from the fall is going to continue exactly as destined, until, they become spiritual seekers, and the knowledge of good and evil, which was put in place, to me it's a metaphor for the new conditioning that life delivered, the knowledge of good and evil, which is sort of like the kid when it's growing up, it starts separating out what it wants and what it doesn't want, and what is acceptable and unacceptable. And then they became seekers, and new conditioning came in and dissolved the knowledge of good and evil, and they started to see life as duality, which the whole includes both good and evil. So now they're not separating it out and resisting one, craving the other, and they end up back in the Garden of Eden and live happily ever after. So the whole story of Adam and Eve, to me, is a story of destiny unfolding exactly as it's destined to unfold. So the notion that they failed, they did what they shouldn't have done, is an interpretation. I say they were destined to, it says in the thing, God gave them free will. Now, free will doesn't mean, in my book, it doesn't mean that they suddenly are unconditioned and making decisions to have the apple based on some fictitious me, but rather free will is you have the feeling that you can do whatever you like, so you can have the apple if you like, but that having the apple is going to be determined by what the serpent has said to them, how they reacted to the taunts that the serpent says, who's God to tell you can't have this beautiful apple? And so there wasn't any doer there. It was God gave them the free will and the conditioning, or the genes, and then the conditioning of the serpent, and it all unfolded from there.
Interesting, very, very interesting. I know there's a lot of stuff here. So I'm just going to end it there. Thanks.
Thanks, Frank.
Appreciate your answers, Rajan. Take care.
Pleasure.
Bye.
You too. We'll take one more question. And hi, Pradeep.
Thank you for this session. And during the last week, I was attending a session given by Gautam, and one way or other, one of the speaker mentioned about your channel as well. And that is how I came into this session. It is really helpful, and I totally resonate with the concept. And thank you for taking time and conducting these sessions. It is really helpful.
That's great.
So I just had one query. So there is this consciousness, right, which is manifested, and unmanifested consciousness, right? So I had confusion. I still have the confusion between the awareness and the consciousness that is there. Mm-hmm. So is there someone who is aware about this consciousness, or the consciousness and awareness, is it one of the same thing? Like, are those two different things, or is it the same thing? That is what I am confused between.
Yeah, it's important for you to see how a particular teaching is using the word, because different teachings will use the word consciousness and awareness in different ways, pointing at different aspects, you could say. So in the teaching of Nisargadatta Maharaj, at least in particular years of his teaching, because it can change as well within a teaching, he would refer to awareness as the big daddy of them all. The awareness is as far back as you can go, and consciousness tends to be referred to sometimes as the personal expression of awareness. When awareness links to a particular body-mind organism and is functioning as a individual, then consciousness is the individuated consciousness. And so when in the spiritual seeking process, we're often encouraged to be the witness or witnessing, where witnessing can happen, and there can be awakening to what feels like and is what is referred to as awareness, where there is it's very impersonal. It seems like it has nothing to do with the person, and so in some teachings, awareness is referred to that which is aware, but has no body, has no age, has no gender, has no preferences, and just witnesses everything that is happening. The awareness doesn't think, awareness doesn't judge, doesn't create, it is just aware. And yet it's said that all of the creation is made of awareness. In other teachings, the word consciousness and awareness are interchangeable. So when in this teaching, sometimes we could say all there is consciousness. So the whole of the manifestation is made of consciousness. And in that case, it is referring to the same thing as awareness. So there isn't an easy answer to your question, because really different teachings will use consciousness and awareness either as interchangeable or as different aspects. And generally speaking, if a teaching uses awareness as source and says source is awareness, then consciousness is relating to a personal expression of source. Actually, the way I use it is in reverse, where I would say there is consciousness, and then consciousness has two primary aspects to it. It has consciousness, and there's the facet of awareness, and consciousness with the facet of I amness or beingness, existence. So consciousness essentially is a label that denotes source, but in practical terms, in practice, source has two ways of functioning simultaneously: the faculty of being aware and the faculty of being, or the sense of existence, I am. So I'm sure that's actually just confused you even more because I've spoken about three different.
At least it at least gave me another point of view, which would definitely help me to understand this better. Yeah, I got it.
So if
Thank
you after thinking about it, if you come back some other time with a specific teaching and say, oh, in which way does this particular teaching use the word consciousness? If I'm familiar with that teaching, I might be able to be more specific. But yeah, please re-listen to this and see if it gives you something to think about.
So some other time I feel like these different words are kind of so sophisticated and make you confused so much. The only essence is that there is, you just want the peace of mind at the end of the day. Mm-hmm. And when you get into these different terms, which are so confusing in different concepts, so that is where it gets more complex to understand it. So sometimes I feel like, okay, let it be aside. Even if I don't know, that doesn't make any difference.
You're very right. Actually, if we just think about trying to work out what consciousness is or awareness is in our head, it can get very abstract and very theoretical, very conceptual, very intellectual. And the main purpose for talking about consciousness and awareness is to bring us to the direct experience of consciousness and awareness. The consciousness is functioning through the human being, so your experience of life is what I would call a personal consciousness experience. So the fact that you can hear my voice and you can see the table and chairs in the room you're in and the computer, all of that is happening within what we can call your personal consciousness experience, or rather all of that daily life experience is your personal consciousness experience. And if we pressed a button and turned consciousness off, so in the English language we say, if someone is hit on the head, they lose consciousness. So if you lose consciousness, the daily life experience is there 1 minute, and then you lose consciousness and it's all gone. And then, as we say, and they regain consciousness, and it's all back again. And the same in deep sleep, there is, let's say, consciousness is withdrawn, and so there is no daily life experience and no dream experience in deep sleep. And then waking up happens and consciousness reemerges and the whole experience of life happens. So you can see that the experience of life is interdependent on consciousness. And the two primary facets of consciousness are the facet of awareness, the very act in the present moment of being aware of the whole life experience. So if we turned off consciousness, we turn off awareness, because awareness is a facet of consciousness. And so if you turn off awareness, the whole experience dissolves, it's not there, and there's no one there. And the simultaneous arising facet of I am existence, the very sense of existence or beingness, is intertwined in awareness, which is why there is the sense in the present moment. I, not necessarily I as the body. It feels like I as the body when we're identified with the body, but even when there's a shift happens and there's a disidentification with the body, there is awareness present, and there is this impersonal sense of existence. I am. So all of these words are really hopefully pointing us to our present moment experience, where the consciousness, the beingness, and the awareness can be known to be what we are.
Thank you. That really helps. Yeah, thank you, Roger.
Very good. Thank you, Pradeep.